So it's definitely been kind of strange times the last week or two.
The strangest times.
Darkest timeline.
So far, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, and I mean, I think as we project into what may or may not happen with all this, I think the important thing is to check in with your community network, check in with your friends and loved ones, and try and act based on evidence.
Certainly, rather than fear-mongering or speculative myths, there's been more than a few of those flying around. And I think one of the things that, aside from all of the ongoing news crush of current events that pushed us into this episode, was we started receiving some really bizarre emails from folks within the psychedelic community at large. I know Nishay brought my attention to a very disturbing email from Trinity de Guzman, who some of y'all may recognize from the ayahuasca healings scam that was playing out in the US. These were the folks who claimed ayahuasca was legal, and all sorts of questionable sort of multi-level marketing type stuff affiliated with them. And
I mean, from Trinity, who himself claimed to be like some kind of ancient transcendental being.
Yeah, I mean, there's threads online, like massive content in terms of people alleging scam or cult kind of vibes around his organizations in general. I won't go into it, but if you Google his name, there's plenty out there. There's also issues with him taking people's money before he kind of absconded to, I think he's operating out of Mexico now, but he's still soliciting money for people to go to his ayahuasca retreats. And Dave, could you read the quote from the email?
Yeah. The excerpt that was particularly disturbing from an email entitled "How to Respond to the Coronavirus." He has it as 2 words. The coronavirus is a necessary purge of what is no longer in resonance. As these souls return back to the source, those who are left have the choice to continue in our old ways or create a drastic reevaluation of all that is important to us and all that drives and motivates us. When death is at our doorstep, we realize none of the money, success, or status even matters. But all that matters is the love we have around us and the connections we've made, the impact and service we have left on the planet and in people's hearts. I think obviously the rather disturbing component there is that the people who are dying from coronavirus, we're no longer in resonance, and what we are seeing is a necessary purge of these non-resonant souls.
Yeah, it's typical like culty, fatalistic kind of longing for destruction and justification of just awfulness in some kind of spiritual bypassy kind of way.
Yeah, I remember when all this stuff was going on a few years ago, when he was just coming out and using the media to promote the thing in the Pacific Northwest, the ayahuasca church.
Ayahuasca healings.
Yeah, you could tell at the time that he had the predisposition of being a culty type guy, and I think I mean, this is like, it's just open now, and people are talking like that. It's very apparent when you're having these videos all dressed in like these white gowns and then sending emailers out like that. It's just straight up cult.
It is working though. I mean, people do pay to go down there, and earlier, a few years ago, when I was seeing what they were emailing out, it included things like, if you're worried about paying thousands of dollars to come to our ayahuasca retreat, that's a sign of the classic argument, your scarcity mentality that's holding you back. It's in your spiritual interest in terms of your spiritual development to let go of that attachment, give us all your money and move forward. And, here it's an extension of it with, you don't want to be part of this bad frequency purge. And so the way to get around that is to pay us thousands of dollars so you can come be part of our ayahuasca healing and raise your vibration to protect yourself. So
Yeah, that's a really common thing in what is it? They call it like large group consciousness raising institutions, like something like Landmark or what is these other ones like Next Level. You go in and then it's sort of a crash course in really confrontational like Zen and existentialism, and then they say things like, it's 600 or more dollars for the next installation. So like be irrational, do the thing that will make you, continue to participate.
Yeah, and I think especially at this time of crisis and uncertainty, and when we see all of these narratives, both from supposed experts as well as clear hucksters and con men, people are looking for answers and solutions and quick fit narratives.
Yeah.
And I think it's really disturbing, sort of in the same way that we've talked about a little bit with eco-fascists, right? There's a shortage of resources, so kill all the brown people.
Right.
There's a spreading novel virus, but everyone who's dying had it coming. That they were just souls who didn't fit into the picture.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of what that could further justify, or what sort of mental leaps you can take from there to whatever other sorts of, whether it's rebuilding efforts in the wake of this, or however this plays out. I just think it's really dangerous sort of moral foundations to lay, personally. And I think that's something we've seen on sort of the most extreme end of the spectrum of communication, coronavirus communication within the broader psychedelic community. Brian, Normie, you had got, it seemed like one email in particular got a little bit under your skin. I know that you had flagged a fundraising pitch that came from ICEers as raising some questionable content. And just to be clear, I think ICEers has done some really great stuff. I've known Ben Delonin for a number of years. I think some of the projects he's done have been really wonderful. I presented at the ayahuasca conference back in 2014. Again, this isn't necessarily a criticism of ICEers as an organization at large, but rather some of the communication that we've seen coming out in this period of time.
Yeah, I'm trying to bring the email up here.
I've got it up. I can just read it if you want.
Yeah, it's go ahead.
So, of course, I said I had it up. So this is the email. The email was titled "Who Will Guide Us in Uncertain Times." I woke up this morning to a flood of news about the impact that COVID-19 is having globally. Stock markets dipping, people dying, governments telling people to stay home, events being canceled, people rushing to stock up on essentials, and more toilet paper than they might need. As I sat down at my desk to write you a message asking you to contribute to our crowdfunding campaign, I thought, really, at a moment like this, can you really ask for donations? So I sat with these questions, did yoga, meditated, spoke with my cherished colleagues, and from deep inside me, an answer surfaced. Yes, the voice said. Yes, now. Yes, now more than ever. It's hard to deny that humanity is at a turning point. The future feels even more uncertain than usual. Like children, we need direction. Who will guide us? Plant teachers, medicine carriers, elders. This was then followed by a pitch to donate money to the ayahuasca defense funds. And, here's the thing. I wanted to comment on this and other kinds of responses to COVID-19 from the psychedelic community. I actually do want to have a little bit of praise for Joe and Kyle. I tuned into their webinar, and they were actually very measured in their response, where people were asking for answers. What should I do?
Today.
Yeah, from Psychedelics Today. Like, should I be taking psychedelics right now? And I mean, in some ways, like, it might have been frustrating to the readers because they were giving very measured responses. I can't tell you to take psychedelics. I wouldn't do that. You have to assess your circumstance, But what we see all the time in the psychedelic community, particularly this like power dynamic that we have discussed on this program over and over again, is that those who are new to the scene are frequently asking for answers from those who have been in the scene for a long time. And there are many within the scene who are happy to provide those answers regardless of whether or not they actually have them. And so, I want to talk a little about how, we are commenting on COVID-19, the coronavirus, something that seems somewhat extremely tangential to sort of our wheelhouse. And yet it's the only thing happening right now. Everybody's thinking and talking about it. But I don't want, what we're doing here to be perceived as us trying to provide anybody any guidance or answers. That's not
no, but you don't look to plant teachers during like a global pandemic. I don't even know what plant teachers actually really means in the first place. It's like
I'm a plant teacher because I studied plant science and I'm teaching horticulture here.
But it's
soon,
not
so.
but Pace, it's not referring to human beings.
If you have some questions about nitrogen levels, let me know.
My problem with it is the line specifically, like children, we need direction, because that orientation of looking outside of yourself for some leader to show up, regardless of whether that's a personified plant entity, teacher, or an expert in the field. What I'm concerned with is we need to have a both and kind of orientation towards the idea of experts, right? Because on the one hand, we're seeing with all of the spread of misinformation and kind of just bad ideas that there is something to being able to hear information from experts on things like virology, epidemiology, and to understand where that information is coming from and not think that you have a viable alternative just because you're, Joe on the couch, and be able to, at the same time, not look for some kind of leader figure to step in and tell you how to interpret your trips, as like David has been talking about before, how to act right now, how to move into the future, that, there's an alternative way of thinking about this, which is as collectives where we pool and share our expertise, our care, our, concerns with each other, and aren't seeking some messiah figure to come and fix everything for us.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, in this context, this is the context which all those messiah figures stop popping out of the woodwork too.
Totally. Well, and I think the point that Nishay just made about, taking sort of expert perspectives, understanding that now is not really a time, if any time is really a time for anti-science, now is certainly not that time. And that there are really important understandings, and there are it takes years to develop expertise in understanding how viruses spread, how pandemics take shape and affect global populations. And at the same time, while we can incorporate that knowledge and understanding to the best of our abilities as we hear from experts in the field, when it comes down to action in our own day-to-day with the people that we're in community with the people that we care about and act with, we shouldn't be looking for somebody else to step in, right? Through, exactly as Nishay pointed out, collective action, figuring out what makes sense in order to meet our needs in the moment, while also understanding from those experts what we can do relatively safely within the moment to meet our needs, right? So it's sort of balancing that, using expert understandings in order to inform our collective action in the moment, rather than waiting for an opportunistic guru to step in and say, this is what you need to do in this moment.
Absolutely.
I mean, there are huge potentials for exploitation right now. And I think,
abuses of power in general.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's been bubbling up from just everyday people's observations about how suddenly there are whole sectors of the economy that are non-essential. suddenly you rely a hell of a lot more on your grocery store stock clerk than you do on any CEO.
Sure.
These kinds of just lived experience observations are becoming central in a way where, Nishay, you had brought up some commentary by Russell Brand.
Yeah, and I did want to go to that next because, I'm sorry to cut you off, but
No.
because he provides an example of someone who is not trying to seize the moment to be a messiah figure or say, pay me millions of dollars to, guide you through a spiritual answer to your problems, but is trying to engage the collective to seize this opportunity as precisely an opportunity to kind of question the status quo in a way that has deep psychedelic roots, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this idea that there's something. Excuse me. Have an asthma cough. It's not a coronavirus cough. So I mean, that which is revealed in crisis is something that I think is going to be continually reassessed here. And it's not lost on me, Naomi Klein's work, The Shock Doctrine. She's also talked about this idea of crisis being a key time where elites push through that which they wanted to do in the first place. And so we're seeing a lot of authoritarian responses being put forth. And I mean, sometimes that makes sense in the sense that there is only, there are only so many right answers for dealing with things that are science-based and such. But what we're seeing is a lot of propping up of industry, propping up of landlords and businesses, not necessarily the same amount of care being put forth towards everyday individuals. I mean, all of this is going on in the backdrop of Bernie Sanders, a character who, a candidate who is pushing for universal health care. It seems like a great time to be talking about universal health care, and yet that's not on the table.
Yeah, Nishay.
Well, before we get past Russell Brand, I wanted to, because we're going to talk a bit about the assumptions that have been undergirding society and what the virus is revealing about that. But just to dwell on Russell Brand for another minute, so has this new coronavirus series that's helping people to, and I find it, I mean, I've been watching a good deal of YouTube videos, and I find it to be probably productive in the sense that a lot of the videos out there are fear mongering and sort of ramping up anxiety for the views, but he's doing something really different. He's trying to provide actionable, both ideas, critiques of society, but also tools for meditation, to ground yourself, to get through this difficult period. So I found it very, useful just in behind his motivations for it. But just to read a quote from, so this is a video, came out March 16th, called Coronavirus, What Has It Revealed? And he said, what I'm most curious about is the way that it challenges our ideas about community, economics, socioeconomic systems that clearly can't hold themselves together. You can't live in abstract economic systems. You can't just do what you want. You can't limitlessly consume. These are all ideas that the virus is sort of emphasizing. The way that it feels when our cathedrals of consumerism are laid bare, the empty, breadless, riceless shelves, and you realize, oh, this is invisibly held together by systems that we usually don't think about. Like Zia Tong said, and this is a quote of someone else, everything is filmed today except where our food comes from, where our energy comes from, where our waste goes. Well, now the unconscious world is surging up. And we have to ask ourselves now, this is what he says, what are we being taught about what is actually important to us? Who can we trust? What values do we have? What is the value of commercial capitalism if when nature surges back, it falls apart? And so I feel like these questions are, they're really similar to what Leary was getting at with this turn on, tune in, drop out, this idea that we've been participating in these systems that were designed by someone else for their benefit. And now when the fact that capitalism couldn't prepare adequately for something it knew would happen. Like, this is not a surprise event. This is not something that came out of nowhere. People literally knew that this was going to happen, and there were no adequate preparations made. So the fact that capitalism could not prepare is an opportunity to kind of question, is that the system we want to be living under going into the future?
Absolutely. And I mean, it's worth noting that actually a synonym for COVID-19 is actually SARS-2. So, we've been here. We're informed by what other nations. China was able to handle, this crisis better than we have, because of the preparation with SARS. The parallel that I and others have been making is one of climate change. We know that climate change is happening. Capitalism is absolutely ill-equipped to deal with it, and I think some of it comes down to some of the fundamental assumptions, of capitalism. One of them is that there are special billionaire geniuses, or entrepreneurs, job creators, and then there are those who are, I guess, as Henry Kissinger once designated, useless eaters. And with regard to where our food comes from, I believe about 50% of the global food supply comes from smallholder peasant farmers. Some of the most forgotten and just shit upon people in the world with regard to the global economy and the deal that they get. And I mean, in terms of resiliency to shock, there is this willingness from elites to view the vast majority of people as expendable. I mean, look at the way that Elon Musk, on Twitter was saying, the craze about coronavirus is dumb. And it's like, of course it's dumb from where you sit.
Sure.
Not only can capitalism not prepare, it can't even imagine the concept of vaccines being free for people. In response to Bernie Sanders saying that once a vaccine is developed, it should be free, there's tremendous pushback on that whole viewed as crazy.
Despite there being great precedent for it, with what we opened.
How could you even? That's pure evil to say that a vaccine for this shouldn't be free. That's totally antisocial behavior.
That's what Trump was trying to do with, trying to pressure that German company to sell the vaccine they were working on just for Americans.
Exclusively.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, America first,
Right. Well, of course. But I think, look, I'll be the first to say that, I'm quite skeptical of a bit of what Russell Brand has said over his career. I saw him at Breaking Convention alongside Daniel Pinchbeck and was not thrilled with a bunch of his overbroad, overgeneral comments made with regards to sort of psychedelic activism or whatever you want to call it. I watched the videos that Nishay had suggested, and actually I thought there was a lot of interesting sort of surface scratching. I found it interesting that the two gurus he decided to highlight happened to be, right, Osho and Muji, both of whom have some rather interesting issues around them, which he acknowledged to some extent. And it would have been nicer to see some deeper dives into the content there. But I think as far as pointing to these broad conceptualizations, the myths that we tell, the stories that we tell, the things that have sort of upheld industrial civilization, capitalism more broadly, American capitalism specifically, I thought he did a really interesting job of pointing, without explicitly saying it, at these broader narratives that don't get examined, that to my mind really deal with the way that within America throughout its history, we've generally seen socialized costs and privatized benefits, where if we look through what Chomsky has referred to as really existing free market theory, we have this notion from the elites, the Elon Musks of the world, the corporate actors, that free markets are fine for you, but not for me, which essentially means that you people who don't have access to the halls of power to affecting legislation, right? that you learn market discipline discipline and responsibility, and that you get to experience tough love, well, I get corporate welfare and subsidies, and that we don't actually acknowledge any of that as state intervention. And that if you look through the leading transnational corporations, you'll pretty much find state intervention, whether we're talking about full bailouts or subsidies or other forms of welfare, throughout history. And one of the things, you know, as Bernie has come up in this discussion already, some people have put out there that in order to address coronavirus and the socioeconomic issues we're seeing around it, it's going to require policies that are significantly more radical than anything Bernie's been suggesting.
Sure.
And that, as Bernie's been putting out, there are currently sort of socialist platforms in the US right now. They just happen to benefit corporate actors and all of that. And
yeah, well,
when people start with how will you pay for it,
right.
It's cynical. It's so yeah.
Of course,
sorry,
it's cynical.
Ahead.
We never ask the question, well, you know, how are you going to pay for the next B-52 bomber or nuke or whatever? Those are completely off the table questions. And I mean, it's worth noting that, you know, something like pollution, climate change itself, literally is a classical market failure called externality. You know, that is what a socialized cost is. You know, whenever you drive by a paper mill and it stinks, well, that's an externality. That's a socialized cost. We don't have to talk about that. I mean, you go by your grocery store and you see plastic bags and paper and product wrappers floating around. Those are externalized costs. And I mean, it's acknowledged in market theory that this is something that markets cannot handle. So, I mean, yeah, the socialized costs, risks, you know, we see it over and over again, and we're going to see it around of bailouts. And ultimately, this opportunity that we have here is to push for alternatives. Like, here we are in crisis. You know, why don't we bail out all of the lenders of student loans to stimulate the economy as much as you know, bailing out or hell, if we're actually bailing out these industries, why don't we just nationalize them, for fuck's sake?
Well, and we'll get to that a little later. Nishay.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I was listening to Anand Giridharadas, who I've mentioned before. I forget, maybe Democracy Now!, I forget where he was saying this, but he was surprised that in 1920, that we have a kind of like fluid understanding of gender, but we don't yet have a fluid understanding of like socialized versus not socialized. Because the fact that we don't exist in a either or society. There's no absolute, you know, and this distinction between, you know, socialization for the benefits for the corporations, that, you know, until we get to a more nuanced understanding of this isn't an all or nothing conversation. And right now it's slanted in the corporate interest. Actually, Pace, could you mention that? I love that thing you just posted on Facebook with the airlines, airlines in 2019. Can you read that or share it? It was really spot on though.
No, it's true. And I mean, like, it's one of those things where it's discipline, you know, it's discipline for all the rest of us. And we're talking about, like, on a basic personal level, this kind of discipline, how we conduct ourselves in person. And I shared a meme from Bia Care, or actually a Twitter status, and it says, you know, airlines in 2019, your baggage is 1 kilogram over, that'll be $150. And no, you can't sit next to your wife, idiot. Airlines in 2020, hello, remember us? We've got a favor to ask. And it's like little kawaii emojis. I mean, this is the thing. It's like, there's a lot of lionization of industry in crisis. I mean, you know, what is it? Ford Motor Company, I think, or no, General Motors was basically, you know, bailed out and practically nationalized in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis.
Nationalized without any degree of actual government control over operations and logistics, right? So we gave them a loan. You know, the taxpayers gave them a loan.
Obama needed that blue wall.
Yeah, and I mean,
right. Well, so But these sort of, sorry, go ahead.
I want to talk about subsidies real quick, because I mean, this is something that I don't know, your average person doesn't really think too much about, but like it's been estimated that the U.S. banking system, without the subsidies that they receive from the government, would break even in terms of profitability. I have a background studying, agriculture. There are 5 commodity crops. You've got cotton, you've got wheat, you've got rice, you've got corn, and you've got soy. If you are a grower of any or all of these crops, which many American farmers are, you receive significant price supports from the government. I mean, the Trump just started a trade war with China, and American soybean farmers can't sell their soy, and they're getting checks. So there are a number of industries that get significant. The oil industry gets a huge amount of government support, and it's like it's crazy because you look at these international trade agreements. I know I'm going off topic.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
But there's all this discipline, So some country like, say, Honduras wants to protect its potato industry, and then like the WTO is going to come in and say, no, you can't do that. You're going to be subjected to import tariffs on anything until you step into line. Meanwhile, our industries are protected like they're babies.
Yeah, and it's not just that, right? Like if we look at all of the technology that we've got in our pockets, on our computers, right? If we look at everything that has been, or the vast majority of our so-called defense technologies, our insanely overdeveloped military technologies. Most of this stuff started in research labs, in publicly funded facilities, and were then allowed to be taken into the private sector to be turned into phenomenal profits. And it's not just that we've seen that in tech. It's not just that we've seen that with farming. It's that this comes back to healthcare. And just to run through a few or a few historical components of healthcare, one of the big questions that it seems to me that a lot of folks aren't asking is, why is my healthcare tied to my job? And there's this really interesting history. So basically, after World War II, the National War Labor Board recognized that there was going to be a glut of employees, and that in sort of company interests, there were going to be desires to hire people, to steal people away from other employers. Basically, you were going to have a huge war over workers. And in an attempt to preemptively staunch that, they introduced a wage cap. However, healthcare was exempt from the wage cap. So it became this incentive to dangle to potential workers that, hey, we'll give you these sort of lush private healthcare plans. Alongside that, the IRS decided that employer contributions to health insurance were going to be tax-free. So workers paid less out of their pocket. And at the same time, penicillin arrived on the scene. So there was more incentive to engage in certain types of medical care. So from the period of 1939 to I think 1952, there was this explosion in private health insurance enrollment from like 8 million people to something like 92 million people. And at the same time, there was an attempt, I think it was like the third major attempt to implement national insurance. But the doctors who were starting to benefit from all this private insurance were like, hold on, if we do national insurance, that's going to limit our ability to charge patients. And so they lobbied against it, basically on a fear-mongering campaign of, oh, if we nationalize this, the government is going to nationalize everything, and everyone's going to lose out on their potential profits. And so ultimately, as a result of this labor or wage cap going back to the post-World War II period, we've got this really bizarre system where health insurance is tied to our jobs. And on top of that, when we see that sort of doctoral lobbying to maximize personal profits for them, we also have this sort of mirror image with the pharmaceutical firms, right? Where, they're standing on the shoulders of giants in the sense of public funding, in public.
I want to talk about that real quick, because here's the thing. So Aaron Schwartz was somebody who he committed suicide after being arrested for writing some script that put like a JSTOR and a bunch of other protected
paywalls.
paywalled journal
research.
articles,
Yeah.
research online. So he was facing like 35 years, and he died when he was 26 by his own hand, rather than spend that time in prison. Now, the thing is that much of this research, was conducted at public universities like every state land grant university, everywhere. So, the scientists doing this work are paid from the public purse. Many of the grants come from NIH, or the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy. So the research itself is being funded from the public, and yet it's just this crazy scandal in academia and academic publishing, that so much of this research is paywalled. Like, the profit margins on this are insane. You have one of these peer-reviewed journals, and it's it's $40 for an article.
Well, it's these massive conglomerate corporations that own a lot of these journals too. It's not just
not like the authors are getting it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So I mean, that just sort of dovetails on what you're saying in terms of so much of basic R&D in technology in the United States and everywhere comes from the public purse in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it gets even more horrific. There's this really wonderful Intercept article called How Big Pharma Will Profit from the Coronavirus, and we'll make sure that's linked in the show notes. But there's a few points that I think tie directly into this, where the author points out that since the 1930s, the National Institutes of Health has put some $900 billion into research that drug companies then use to patent brand name medications, right? We also have the fact that from 2010 to 2016, every single drug approved by the FDA involves science funded with tax dollars through the NIH, right? And so we've spent, as taxpayers, more than $100 billion on that research, and we've never seen that paid back into NIH or into any sort of collective database or collective effort that would benefit taxpayers from that research. So we're looking at pure extractivism in that the public agencies don't share in those absurd and obscene profits. And we've even seen sort of more egregious cases where there's this drug called sofosbuvir, which is used to treat hepatitis C. It's currently owned by Gilead Sciences, which I think charges more than $1,000 per pill. Now, Gilead is also doing research around coronavirus stuff. Won't get into that right now. But basically, Gilead decided to purchase that drug based on their own economic predictions that they could jack up the price and essentially profiteer off of it. So all of these narratives about why pharmaceutical companies are doing this and how they've been allowed to act, this actually runs, I would say it goes from standing on the public's shoulders to standing on the public's neck when we look at what's being discussed around coronavirus, where you get Health Secretary Alex Azar in front of Congress, and when he's asked if a coronavirus vaccine would be affordable for all, forget Bernie's, it should be free for all, you've got Azar saying, we would want to ensure that we work to make it affordable, but we can't control that price because we need the private sector to invest. Price controls won't get us there. Now, never mind the amount of public funding that's making this all possible in the first place, that's contributed to these pharmaceutical profits and their existence in the so-called free market from the get-go. These sorts of responses are utterly untenable. I mean, there's literally nothing that they can base this on other than the fact that, they happen to have this incestuous relationship between, government, industry. Azar was a pharmaceutical.
But this is how it has been. This is how it has been for multiple generations now. This is why they get into government in the first place. I mean, that's just as bullshit. Azar being a Gilead lobbyist. Was he a lobbyist?
Yeah,
the head lobbyist.
So.
I mean, but just look back to the first Obama administration in the financial crash. Timothy Geithner was the Treasury Secretary. It's just as bullshit then, as it is now. But this goes back forever. It's not about the public. It's not about taking care of people. It hasn't been that way forever.
No.
And those who even bring it up are painted as socialists or painted as communists.
Yeah, not just socialists. It's like this totalitarian communist.
Yeah, if you're not for free market capitalism, you're automatically
and yet
a communist.
Put your air
Yeah,
quotes around free
examples
market.
abound, because I mean, like, they did not put going to the moon to the free market. That was absolutely a government project. Like, in fact, there's some quote from an astronaut, and he says, "What was going through your head when you were getting into that rocket on that fateful day?" And he said, "Well, that every part of this rocket was built by the lowest bidder." I mean, like, these are government contracts, and they've done incredible things. So I mean, basically, the internet was built by the Pentagon. Like, you just look at defense contractors, and they're building, the most cutting edge technology. And then what happens? Like, stuff from the Pentagon gets farmed out to the private sector. Like, it is corporate welfare, and has always been corporate welfare of the highest order. It's this public-private partnership where the military-industrial complex is an engine for technology.
And back to what Nishay was saying about Brand's points before, it's just pulling down the veil of how things already are.
Yeah.
And if you're outraged now, I mean, people have been outraged forever, because this is how it has worked forever. There's people at the fringes of the empire who have been dealing with this forever. If you're an Iraqi, you've been dealing with this since 1980 or whatever, that you've been in a state of constant war. Or you're starving to death and freezing to death as a child in Syria right now, like,
or Yemen.
Go ahead,
all over the place.
The key thing, I think, is that right now, that story, like, Dave, I forget how you phrased it, but that line of like, well, who's going to pay for it? Suddenly all of this money is becoming available, and all of this, justification for giving to corporations. And it just shows that, I forget the word you used, but shows cynical. Yeah. It shows how cynical that has always been. That line has always just been to shut down the conversation, but people have bought into it before. And so I think this is one of the big moments where we have a chance to get people on a large scale to mobilize, organize, and question those narratives.
Well, as Andrew Yang said the other day, if your house is on fire, you're not going to worry about how much the water costs.
No, you're not. And I mean,
except for the libertarians who want to,
totally.
The word for what you were describing is austerity. And
but it's austerity for the people. It's not,
I mean, but the idea is the destruction of, say, public infrastructure, public, programs, and using this logic of who's going to pay for it. For how long have we talked about the deficit and the I mean, I was a kid in the 80s, and Republicans were yelling about the deficit and how it was going to affect, future generations. And now I'm that future generation, and I'm really still not clear how an unbalanced budget in an era of modern monetary theory where quantitative easing can like literally print money and inject it into the economy is an issue, other than to be used as a stick to discipline the working class. Say this is to essentially say this is why you can't have nice things. Well, and it's going to be challenged in this era where crisis is going to make people really ask and start demanding, why can't we have not just nice things, but things that keep me and my family safe and alive?
Basic human rights. And I think, as much as there is, as this is an incredibly important time to examine these narratives on the broad scale, to bring this back to our wheelhouse a little bit, it's also like, this is part of the reason why we've been talking about the absurdity of some of the psychedelic narratives around the pharma companies and the intellectual property, precisely because they represent this old paradigm. And that should be laid incredibly bare right now, whether we talk about Compass's attempts to patent the old Hoffman patents, Compass being the sort of wellness pharma company that's focusing on psilocybin largely for the moment.
Where are those air quotes for wellness?
Right, wellness, there you go. That we're seeing this level of extractivism of nonprofit and research institutions that have gone on, you've even got Rick Doblin of MAP saying, right, oh, well, if we've done our job, now is the time for the for-profits to come in and essentially extract all of the stuff that people have funded, that the research institutions have put together, and wall off and make into for-profit sort of products. And at the same time, you've got George Goldsmith of Compass, when he's asked directly about affordability of treatment and this, that, and the other, and why they have patents, he says, oh, we'll never use those patents. We just have the patents in order to insure our investors and bring them in and let them know that it's going to keep our market value up. Well, you have that because if you have those walls, if you have those potential obstacles in place, that means that you can use those patents. The reason your investors feel safer is because you can deploy that intellectual property to keep other people's hands off. And so we have Goldsmith essentially saying the same thing as Azar, as in, if we can't give our investors, if we can't give these private firms reasons to believe that they'll be able to profit, we can't actually ensure this development. And as Nishay pointed out earlier, if private healthcare couldn't respond to this predictable event of pandemic, right, at the point where the Trump administration was literally walked through a training exercise by the Obama administration dealing with like a ridiculous outbreak of influenza that became a global pandemic. There's some really interesting articles about how that training exercise went. Right? How are we going to expect that psychedelic pharmaceuticals are somehow going to break the mold? Sorry, Pace, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to comment on how, we've previously talked about how medicalization is an absurd proposal with regard to providing access to these, these medicines or these substances, these experiences, because you just need to look around. People don't have access to medicine. They don't have access to therapy under the current, model. And so we see these actors moving into the space, and their primary motivation, their legal obligation to their shareholders is profit. And this is something that can be extracted from the current model as it currently functions, but it needs to be acknowledged and stressed and brought up every single time that this model is inherently exclusionary.
And,
right. It's more likely that, go ahead, Nishay.
Well, just the way that this virus has spread and the way that it came about are fundamentally tied to the capitalist system that we live under. And so it facilitated this virus. It was unable to prepare for this virus. And so trying to shove psychedelics into this paradigm that has failed to, provide an adequate way of life for people just doesn't make sense to any of us.
Yeah.
Right. It's more likely that we'll see pump and dump stock games, that we'll see silly sort of intellectual property claims like psilocybin for weight loss and whatever else, than we'll see meaningful healthcare come from psychedelic therapy under this particular system. And I think one of the questions that we've all been talking about is, if the free market is the best arbiter of treatment, of care, of any of these services, then why is there so much talk about retooling and reimagining how we're doing so-called business as usual in the face of coronavirus?
I don't think that question can even be taken seriously.
It can't be.
Is the free market? It's not. I just read a fantastic piece in Jacobin the other day that shows with MRSA and these other with these other superbugs, that right now their current pharmaceutical companies are not even really working in them because there's no profit to be made in them.
Right.
And so they're reliant
on preventative
on
medicine.
Yeah, and so they're reliant on these small startups and government funding, and finding investors is incredibly difficult. We know these things are on the horizon right now. And it's not being taken care of. The system cannot address this. It never has been able to address it.
So, I mean, one of the things that is common in sort of statistics land is like when the data consistently does not conform to the model that you're trying to apply to it, the only real solution is to find another model to describe what you're looking at. And what we hear over and over again from, capitalists and those who promote capitalism but don't actually own any factories, I think we call these people bootlickers, is that this idea that capitalism is the best system for lifting people out of poverty and for advancing human freedom. And, whether or not like it's served as an engine for, technological advancement, that's pretty undeniable.
Yeah,
But
right after the age of monarchy, perhaps
right,
it's a good idea for a little bit.
exactly. So I mean, the thing is that like this is why left critiques are important, because they do provide this alternative model. They provide vocabulary that says no, that's not government being like bad and broken. That's elites making sure that you don't ever believe that government can improve your life. So hence we have austerity, we have all kinds of ridiculous things that are there by design to frustrate you, to to depress your ability to participate in civil society,
even
to
paying
demoralize
taxes in
Exactly.
our country. Like they did not want, like other countries, they have it just like automatically seamlessly come out of your paycheck and you don't even need to see it. They didn't want that to happen here. They wanted it to be an onerous, horrible process to make people have a negative feeling about paying taxes and taxes in general.
Well, when you have administrations like the Bush administration, it is going to raise a cohort of people who are going to be super cynical on the government in the first place. When you see responses like this.
Yeah.
Sure. It's not going to inspire people to want to pursue a career in public service. Like that's what it is, public service. And I think that's what it should be. It's about public service. We can replace the word government and everything. It's public service, and there needs to be a bigger emphasis on public service right now.
Or public opulence, because that is something that I think that it's a phrase that people don't really hear much. But I've often wondered, what if we had mass transit in this country and every fucking parking lot was a plaza? And having spent time in places like Latin America, there are things called plazas, and they're everywhere. They're places for people to congregate and, hold quinceañeras or just all kinds of festivals. Like it's been remarked that, your average waged laborer in the United States has less days off than a medieval peasant did. And David Graeber, who's an anarchist anthropologist, he put together first an essay on the phenomenon of bullshit jobs, and then a book called Bullshit Jobs: A Theory. He posits that it's not for economic reasons that we're all working 40 to 50 hours a week. It's for political reasons. It's keeping us out of the hair of the elite. We like look at, to sort of get things back to psychedelics real quick. The ballot box was effectively utilized to do something that was thought to be impossible, at the state level, or rather the city level, and legalize psychedelics, like something that was, forever thought as just an absolute, fringe freakout thing. And all it took was people organizing themselves. So keeping people busy is a great way to prevent that.
Sure. And I think that actually ties into some of, as we look at the coronavirus stuff and the questions that are coming up around economic models and around, seeing some of the immediate effects of lack of production, less airline travel, all of these things. Suddenly we see realities that raise significant questions about the narratives we've heard around addressing climate change. Right? That the notion of essential versus non-essential travel, or scaling back production, or questions about what it would mean to have a universal basic income while people are incentivized to work less in order to reduce some of the ecological destruction that
unthinkable
consumerism is predicated on, right? We've been told it's unthinkable, except now that these things would lead to people killing each other by transmitting this virus. Suddenly we see actually it's not only tenable, but like it's having some of the effects that folks like Naomi Klein and others have been talking about for ages, right? And so this is giving us at least a glimpse that these other worlds are possible. And the questions about how we conceptualize these things, right? Pace, earlier you were talking about bailouts versus sort of nationalization. And we've seen these sort of light scale, some people have called it nationalization, looking at 2008, 2009 with the bank bailouts and the auto industry, except that, the state didn't actually put certain safeguards into place or meaningfully intervene in the way that small oligopolies were running these industries. And just real quick, as we're looking around now, we can see that Spain, which had a public-private healthcare system, has actually nationalized the private healthcare players, at least for the short term, at least just to provide services and make it more easily manageable for the time being to ensure that people are getting care. But as we talk about things like airlines and fossil fuels and healthcare and the internet, I mean, what is the potential for viewing these things as utilities, right? The notion that these are things that we need in order to have some modicum of industrial civilization, if that's a thing we want, recognizing that these things should be operated for the public good or in public interest, and actually taking them over rather than bailing them out.
So you mentioned public good. That's another classic market failure. The market cannot regulate public goods like clean air. Can't do it. So I mean, but some of many of the industries that you talked about, like the subsidies, are insane. I mean, I think a lot of people are just realizing from a very common sense way, if a global pandemic is going to, a minor interruption of industry, or rather a major one, but at least a temporary one, is going to cause these industries to fail, like the airlines, for instance. It's again another example of rules for thee and not for me, where we're being told, millennials, I guess we all fall roughly in that demographic, to save for a rainy day. And if we lose our jobs or have to change careers 10 times or move to a different state, maybe we should stop like eating avocado toast and stuff. But the industry, these captains of industries, these people that we're all supposed to look up to and emulate and such, like, they shit the fucking bed. And what do they get? They get a bailout. And here's the thing: the global financial system is something that got a bailout in 2008, 2009. Now, who really bailed them out? It was China. Right now, China is super destabilized. There's not the capacity to do anything of that scale. And we are having a stock market crash on the scale of, 1929-ish, on top of, something surpassing the Spanish flu. Like, these are stacked emergencies here. And it's just like, now more than ever, while people are, I don't know, binging The Office or something, it's important for people to start getting critical and looking at these alternative models and applying them to their communities, so that we can get out of this with something else.
And part of that is also joining alliances with people like incarcerated folks. Because for me, psychedelic activism is not about just trusting the plants and sitting back and waiting for things to sort out. Psychedelic activism is an intersectional psychedelic activism that cares about the people that have been harmed by the drug war, who are now in prisons being forced to make
Hand
hand
sanitizer.
sanitizer. Thank you.
Or
That
actually
they
just
can't
going to
even
be
use potentially.
that
'cause
are
it's
just going to be dying
alcohol.
in prisons, actually.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
because it's like they're so vulnerable and they are being mobilized in this way. And so we cannot just sit back in our homes with Zoom, chatting, watching Netflix. We need to be thinking about the implications of these systemic inequities and joining forces to mobilize against the systems that are currently oppressing people.
Well, and I think that that point actually ties in really well to some of the narratives that have gone around about, oh, you know, it's a virus. It doesn't actually select who it infects, you know, along lines of race, class, gender, whatever. And yet, if we look at the socioeconomic system under which this virus is unfolding, right? Who is in the healthcare industry? Who is in the service industry? Who is on the front line of provisionary industry? Right? Who's stocking your grocery shelves? We see it's predominantly poorer folks, blacker folks, browner folks, women. Right? Like so. If your socioeconomic situation dictates that you're choosing between being able to secure your paycheck by showing up and putting yourself at risk of transmission, right? If you compare that with somebody who works a white collar job, who maybe already is getting direct deposit, who the only thing, and I not the only thing, but the main thing that's shifted is now they work from home, they communicate via Zoom, and their paycheck hits their bank account the same way that it normally would. They're able to wall themselves off by virtue of their position in society. So this isn't an equal opportunity infector. You know,
I mean,
so
we know this from the past, and I would love it if we could talk a little bit more about like Silvia Federici's work, but I don't think we have time. But anybody interested, check out Caliban and the Witch. She talks about labor and the Black Death. But I wanted to like say, you know, just a moment ago, Nishay talked about systemic inequities. And we often see people talk about systemic failure. Now, I don't think that's a good way of talking about it, because I saw somebody holding
to do this.
I saw somebody holding a protest sign someplace. The system isn't broken; it was designed this way.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, even just more recent policies like Donald Trump dismantled the CDC pandemic response apparatus that was there.
or NSC, right?
Yeah, I may be off on these things.
Sorry,
but, you know, there was some kind of like pandemic preparedness thing at the federal level that was cut along with, you know, all kinds of EPA cuts and other things, and that wasn't, you know, it wasn't accidental.
Well, similarly, like with the tax cuts, right, where industries like airlines use their tax cut to engage in a bunch of stock buybacks, which fundamentally enriched insiders, right, enriched like holding firms, enriched people who were in a position, you know, very close to that industry, and at the same time spent huge chunks of their cash reserves. So now when they need those cash reserves, they're saying, we don't have any. Now, why don't they have any, right? Like this,
because stock buybacks are the avocado toast of the CEO set.
Absolutely,
right.
yeah.
And this actually ties in, I think, really well to something that Normie's talked about a good bit over the last week or two with me about Naomi Klein's sort of sense of a people shock, right? And based on Milton Friedman's notion that these ideas are sort of lying around, and in a time of crisis, you go to these ideas that have been hanging out at the fringe. Normie,
Well,
Chicago School economist Milton Friedman, for those unaware.
Yeah, who viewed all any
extraordinary.
sort of government intervention as a distraction, as a roadblock, because the pure free market would handle everything properly. I just think it's really fascinating that, you know, two political figures in Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang, like, you know, because she basically the disaster, who she calls the disaster capitalists, you know, Milton Friedman and the Chicago boys, economists who, you know, these are free market economists, they're fundamentalists. You know, basically they have these ideas lying around. When disaster strikes, they're going to ram them through. And so, you know, she uses multiple examples: the collapse of the Soviet Union,
Katrina.
South Africa. She starts the book off with Katrina and how one of the first responses was the privatization of schools right away.
Actually, she starts off that book with MK
Right.
Ultra.
Yeah.
Right.
Shock.
When she gets
And
actually
that's
into
why
the economics.
this is why anybody listening to this who's interested in psychedelics but not so sold on this whole like leftist stuff that we're always talking about, read Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, because she's one of the only leftists to really engage directly with the horror that was MK Ultra, and she does a really good job of relating it to the way that international interventions in other people's economies is following a very similar logic.
Yeah, the fascinating thing about her talking about MK Ultra is that she basically says the whole mind control thing was basically just a cover story, from the CIA, and that, which I think is fascinating. And she posits that the use of psychedelics was actually in discovering a method of torture, like a scientific, like really effective method of torture, and they just threw to journalists in Congress that it was a mind control program. But that's another story. What I was saying is, I think it's fascinating. Yeah. I think it's fascinating that immediately when pandemic or crisis on this level, which is unprecedented in anyone's lifetime in America right now, or in the West right now, is what are the ideas that are lying around? That's one of the major things. So when a disaster strikes, man-made or natural causes. In the case of Iraq, they just basically deployed this philosophy into Iraq immediately. The country's destroyed, and we're going to immediately start moving the multinationals in and rebuilding the country without the Iraqis, blah blah blah. But right now, it's fascinating to see that basically UBI is like one of the first things. Like, we have to do this to even keep the system alive right now.
That's universal basic income,
right? Or it's laid bare the need to get everybody covered, the healthcare covered immediately, instantly. It's no longer a radical thing. It's actually capitalism. Sit down, pause, and we actually need to do these things right now. So when we actually go back to capitalism, we can actually go back to it. We need to. I saw Mitch McConnell with Dana Bash on CNN last night or the night before, basically saying like we need to take a pause right now.
Absolutely. I think that was. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, which is a clear indicator that capitalism is definitely the most adaptable and nimble system for handling any situation that is ever going to, that was one other David Graeber quote I wanted to say, which is this. David Graeber says, in times of crisis, communism is what is always the default because it's the only thing that works.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of merit to that. And this actually, I would say, goes back to Nishé's earlier point about self-organizing, about not looking to people to step in and offer you a solution, but rather to engage in acts of mutual aid.
Community. You have to rely on the community more than you have ever relied on the community. Right now, my grandma, she's in indefinite quarantine at a nursing home right now, and they're taking all the steps. Yeah, and they're taking all the steps to protect those people. But like, you now have to rely on the healthcare workers who are there. Like, you have to rely on them not being sick, and like, you have to rely
and
on
not showing up to
not
work
gonna
sick.
showing up to work sick. Like, you now have to completely rely on the community. Who are the biggest heroes in the community now? I go into the grocery store over here, and these people are encountering thousands of people every day.
Yeah, they better
and
get a fucking parade, first of all. I want to clarify real quick though, because the David Graeber quote on communism, it was preceded by this idea, which is a common Marxist maxim, which is, from each that which they're able, and to each that which they need. And this is clearly the logic that always kicks in whenever there's a crisis. let's get it done. We'll deal with it later. I mean, anybody who's been in any situation of crisis, friends whip out their credit cards, like you dig into your basement and get that thing, and it doesn't matter. You just need to meet the need, and that's what I wanted to clarify.
When your house is on fire, you don't put it out yourself. You rely on the community. Firefighters.
We're
to come
social
over
firefighters
and-
used to be private. They
Sure.
used to
Well,
be
that's
private.
how. Interestingly, that's how. Little history lesson here. That's how Crassus of the Roman Empire actually made all his fortune. When he'd basically go to when the house was on fire, he'd basically say, "Oh, you either pay me." What did he do?
He said, "You either sell me the building,
right?
Right, because I love Roman history too." Yeah, he showed up and he said, "You either sell me this building at 25% of its value,
right.
or I just stand here and watch it burn." And he employed some of the first firefighters, and that's how he became an incredibly wealthy man. And then
right, my dad was a firefighter, and people would go. A lot of times, you see firefighters that are sitting in front of the building outside on a hot night or something like that, and he would always say, people would go by and they'd say, "What are you guys doing? Taxpayers, what are you guys doing sitting out here?" And you say, "Okay, when your house is on fire, call the post office."
Right.
Well, but and I think that sort of disaster profiteering, it's not just what happens in the moment, it's what can you build out of things, right? And so as there's a lot of talk right now about surveillance, healthcare surveillance, right, that we need to be able to keep an eye on the population. I forget which country it was just implemented wristbands, electronic wristbands to ensure that people are self-isolating when they come into the country.
All that data.
There's talk in the U.S. right now. Clearview AI, Palantir. These are huge surveillance firms that are in discussion with the government about what sort of technologies and approaches they can leverage from a so-called public health perspective. Now, even if we want to assume best intentions in the moment, which
don't.
I think is,
they're bad
okay,
actors.
but even if we do that, right? Let's imagine at the point where, assuming this blows over, when it blows over, these firms will have mined absurd and obscene amounts of data from this, and they're going to be in a position to continue to do that. At the point where that is their economic prerogative, at the point where that is literally their reason to exist, why would they stop? How would they stop? At the point where they're that entrenched and they have these connections to government, where they have the cash flowing in, where they've built out their databases to that much more absurd of a level. And to bring it back to psychedelics, where some of the same stakeholders and shareholders in these companies are also major shareholders in psychedelic pharma, and they're looking to engage in wearables and more health data scraping from psychedelic and wearable assisted psychedelic psychotherapy. These are significant questions that I think are at the convergence of this health crisis, whatever sort of psychedelic healthcare paradigms we might imagine for the future, these actors who aren't going away, these firms and individuals. And so I think there's going to be a huge number of questions for society at large about what it means to protect our own data, about what it means to be in relation with some of these companies, especially if we see some of these things mandated down the pike. And so it's not just that this is an opportunity for the people shock. It's not just that this is an opportunity for us to come together and reimagine what systems we might be able to live in aside from capitalism. But it's also a moment to be, I think, on heightened alert about what the government or what some of these corporations are going to try to cram down.
Of course, because that is the central service that Naomi Klein provided by giving us this framework of understanding how shock is the moment where they're going to, you gotta keep your eye on the ball because they're going to pull the old switcheroo right then. And I mean, here's the thing is that what you're just saying right here, Palantir, Palantir is a huge data corporation, and they slurp up any and all data. Is it your utilities? Is it how many traffic tickets you've got?
They have a multi-million NIH contract.
Right. So here's the thing, these are the people who want to get into, your psychedelic psychotherapy. What more intimate knowledge can one learn about somebody than what might come out in those sessions? Now, can we imagine some sort of dystopian like situation where that information might be used, I don't know, coercively? Well, yeah, because some of that was dealt with in MK Ultra, where interviews from people were, mined for emotionally charged extracts, and then when they were under the influence of barbiturates, they had headphones like these, playing some of those phrases over and over again to try and destroy people's identity. Now, am I saying that that's what Palantir has in store? No. I'm going to say that, certain corporate actors are a lot more creative. They've got some team thinking about how to do it to get you to, buy different products. Point is that like why we talk about these big, systemic issues is because they do directly pertain to the way that psychedelics are unfolding. We have to know the context to be able to get anywhere with understanding where we might be going.
So
like
I want to get back into what we were talking about before,
Yeah.
just very briefly on externalities and on market failures.
Sounds good.
The mental health that like we're seeing is a market failure.
Absolutely.
Depression, anxiety, suicide, those are all also externality market failures.
Absolutely.
And they've been created by the system that is now being melted away from us right now. They're right behind that. That's, that system has caused that. So I don't understand why, I just really struggle in how like that same system is going to fix it.
It's not.
That same system caused it, and we're seeing it now. We're just seeing all of that right now. Like this system of hyper-consumer capitalism is what has caused this. Having useless fucking jobs is the monotony of the fucking useless jobs that are not important is what has caused the mental health crisis. But yeah, we're going to turn to the same people who have caused that
and the same
to solve our mental health.
Yeah, and that's why I said at a Brooklyn event, like in the psychedelic world, like we are not all on the same team. Like there is no purpose in trying to, find compromise with the psychedelic capitalists. Like they're not thinking in the same way that we are, and we don't gain anything by trying to fit our agenda into their agenda. And so finding the people who have accepted that that's not the way forward, and then working on these alternative community-based forms of organizing, and that's the way that we think is the best way forward.
If you're speaking about mental health and you're not speaking about systemic problems and public policy, I don't know what you're doing, because that's what's causing it. And maybe there'll be an acknowledgement of this now.
I mean, it seems like people are starting to acknowledge it. And just real quick to clarify.
Not only acknowledge it, but to actually let's do something about it, though.
Well, okay, but I would say first we have to acknowledge it at the point where enough people, where perhaps people who were willing to accept the more mainstream narratives about capitalism and the so-called free market and all of that, at the point where the system has been laid bare yet again. I mean, for me, well, just real quick to clarify, when I was talking about bracelets earlier, it's Hong Kong. But when we're talking about these narratives being laid bare, for me, I was incredibly active in the Occupy movement around the time of the global financial crash. And as somebody who, at the time was like 21, 22, I remember seeing, for me, it was like the curtain was pulled back, right? The economic system was exposed to be totally fraudulent, was exposed to have all of these dynamics. Everything that I had read about intellectually or conceptually prior to that was suddenly on display. And for me, it felt like suddenly they pulled the curtain back over it and said, you haven't seen anything, stop paying attention, go about your business, nothing to see here. And yet here we are again in a way where it's so much more undeniable that my hope would be that more people will get the message that like, this is what it is, and now we have opportunities to organize together, even
Well, now we
amidst,
have
like,
social
this
media. Now we
unfolding
have all these
horror story.
methods of communication and the way that people are just talking to one another now. You know, there could be a difference. I mean, after the financial crash, look at the two political wings that really emerged from it. Donald Trump is a direct culmination of like a Tea Party movement that turned into this, you know, white nationalist movement. That's what he is. And that's a decade in the making, you know. And I think you could argue that Bernie Sanders might be that same person on the left, whether that's Occupy related or whatnot. But like, we're still in that those massive political changes. So this isn't gonna, what we're seeing now, this is gonna unfold over the next generation, you know.
Yeah. So, you know, Dave, you were just talking about how Occupy, you know, pulled back the, you know, the veil. You know, the financial crisis clearly called into question this, you know, fundamental market logic that markets regulate themselves. And well, they didn't regulate themselves. And now we're in this sort of like ideological, I don't know, sort of afterlife where something's been negated and we're still wandering around in a daze like a hungry ghost trying to figure out what's what. So, I mean, I think the COVID situation, the COVID-19 coronavirus situation for everybody, like, because there are a lot of people self-isolating. I think it's like 9% of the global economy, or of the US economy, is unemployed as a result of these bar and service industry closures. So a lot of people looking around going, wait, what happened? And what we're seeing is a piercing of the veil of what I believe, I think his name is Mark Fisher, calls capitalist realism. And I use this quote, I've used this quote in other writings. So there's this quote that says, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than an end to capitalism. And some people attribute it to Slavoj Žižek, and other people to attribute it to Frederick Jameson. But the idea is that there's this pervasive atmosphere that capitalism is the default. It's why we often talk about the system as if the system doesn't have a name, and that name is capitalism. So right now we're seeing sort of a surreal moment for people where they're saying, wait a minute, like, I thought I was a schlub who couldn't pay my bills, but, you know, capitalism is the best system on planet Earth, and it can't even keep a global pandemic from, you know, catching like wildfire. So I think there's a lot that is being revealed, and hell yes, we're going to politicize the shit out of this crisis.
Well, it's a political issue. I mean, you know, again, politics are power relationships. As human beings, when we discuss how we relate to other beings, it's all fucking political. And the sooner more people recognize that and realize what tools we have at our disposal, whether collective action or mutual aid, or, you know, however you want to frame that, you know, we need to be working together on these political questions.
I've heard it said, you know, that politics is about who gets what, when, and how. And, you know, in a situation of, you know, quarantine, scarcity, those questions become, you know, rather pressing. And I think that, you know, in the interest of stating our values and openly, and, you know, so that people can critique us if we are not acting in accordance of them, you know, I think that this logic of hierarchical value being attached to certain people based on what is in their bank account, and, you know, whether or not they came from a quote unquote good family, it's something that flies in the face of dealing in a sensible way with a pandemic, you know. So
I think that's probably a good place to wrap. For folks listening, just so you know, we've got a few other episodes that we've banked. We'll be releasing those after this episode. It just felt important to us to get something out relating to this massive crisis as it's unfolding, rather than just sort of continuing to stay in our little bubble of psychedelics. So, thanks y'all for coming along on this ride. And there will be other episodes coming out that are probably a little retroactive, but are still really important from our
I have
perspective.
a quick question for our audience out there. Any of you who may find yourself with a little bit more time on your hands right now, who may have, say, binged the last several episodes, I'd be interested to hear what that experience was like. So if you have a more global view of what we've been producing, send us an email.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again for.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No,
I was just going to say thanks again for tuning in. It's been great having you.
I was going to say, if you have elderly parents or grandparents, give them a call.
Yeah.
Because more than most people, they're, they can't be around anybody right now, or a lot of them can't. So give them a call, talk to them. That's
Last
it.
Thoughts, Nishay?
Yeah, just take care of each other in general.
Like
I think it's a good principle. Yeah. Well, thanks, guys.